What if I told you that the most adored president of the United States led a double life so scandalous that it would instantly destroy any contemporary politician? We are discussing John F. Kennedy, the charismatic leader who won people over. However, behind closed doors, a complex network of clandestine activities was being planned that involved organized crime, the White House personnel, and Hollywood. Jackie, his wife, was aware of all of them. She observed her husband holding work meetings that turned into love get-togethers. While slender women half her age were swimming in the White House pool with her husband, she grinned for the cameras. The Kennedy administration was on the verge of collapse due to one particularly deadly affair. Here's the worst part, though. Blocks from the White House, one claimed mistress was killed by execution. The CIA set fire to her journal. She was pregnant with the president's child, according to another. And wait till you hear about the intern, who was 19 at the time, losing her virginity in Jackie's own bedroom to JFK. You'll see why these weren't casual flings by the end of this film. They were calculated chances that may have brought down the world's most powerful man. We're keeping track of all the women Kennedy is accused of having an affair with. You'll start to doubt everything about Camelot after reading number 3. In the 1960s, politicians were shielded by the media. Women had little choices, and having power allowed them to get away with nearly anything. Kennedy was not your typical president. His attractiveness pulled others to him like moths to flame, and he was young and devastatingly handsome. Jackie was not a gullible, naive wife. She was astute, and she knew exactly what her husband was doing. She once described Jack as being similar to her father in that he enjoyed the pursuit, but grew disinterested in the victory and needed continual affirmation that he was still beautiful. What kept her there? Why put up with intimate betrayal and public humiliation? You may be surprised by the response. Let's start by discussing the women who are said to have had private moments with the most powerful man in America. The woman too hazardous to keep is Ellen Romick. Let's begin with a name that shocked the government, but most people had never heard of. Ellen Romick was a beautiful German woman who resembled Elizabeth Taylor. She wasn't your typical socialite. According to reports, she was a wealthy call girl who had connections to some of the most influential men in Washington. In the spring of 1963, Romesh was allegedly going to the White House for naked pool parties. But it wasn't her career or beauty that made her genuinely dangerous. It was her upbringing. The FBI believed she might be providing information to foreign intelligence because she was German and married a sergeant in the German army. Robert Kennedy directly intervened since the situation had gotten so bad. Before Romick became a national security threat, he had her discreetly deported. Consider that. The security of the entire nation was at risk, thus the president's own brother had to conceal his affair. Rome, however, did not go unnoticed. She was aware of secrets that may have brought down other high-ranking leaders in addition to JFK. Investigative journalists took notice of her abrupt disappearance because it was so suspicious. However, the tale was buried so deeply that it wasn't revealed for decades. The love that nearly turned everything around was Gunilla von Post. We are now in an area that has the potential to literally change the course of history. Swedish socialite Gunilla von Post alleged that Kennedy and she had a 6-year relationship that began in 1953 when he was engaged to Jackie. However, this was more than a passing fancy. It seems that this was considerably deeper. Their first encounter on the French Riviera was like a romance film, according to von Post's memoir. She told how Kennedy's eyes were bluer than the ocean as he kissed her in the moonlight. Here's the horrifying part, though. This occurred barely 3 weeks prior to Kennedy's scheduled marriage to Jackie. What transpired 2 years later is what makes this explosive. Kennedy reportedly told his father that he wanted to leave Jackie to be with her, according to von Post. What would have happened if JFK had divorced Jackie in favor of a Swedish socialite? There would have been disastrous political repercussions. However, those hopes were dashed when Joseph Kennedy Sr. intervened and warned his son that the controversy would ruin his political future. Here's evidence that this relationship was genuine. In 2021, Kennedy and von Post's love letters were put up for auction, providing historians with hitherto undiscovered personal information. In one letter, Kennedy begs von Post to come visit, describing how much he missed her and their amazing time together. These were not informal messages. They were the fervent entreaties of a man divided between ambition and love. The White House secretaries are fiddles and fatties. Kennedy's affairs went from dangerous to completely irresponsible at this point. Security nicknames for White House employees Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan were Fiddle and Faddle. These weren't identity-protecting code names. Everyone knew they weren't there to take calls or type letters. Therefore, they were mockeries of their work performance. Wet hair is the most telling detail. After skinny diving with the president in the White House pool, several witnesses saw Cowan and Ware at their desks with drenched hair. Imagine that. While his wife was in another area of the building, the leader of the free world splashed around nude with his secretaries. However, it becomes increasingly absurd. Kennedy frequently traveled with Ware on official visits to Berlin, Rome, Ireland, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Nassau. She rarely appeared to be performing official tasks, according to former Secret Service personnel. Rather, she was effectively Kennedy's taxpayer-funded travel companion. This is especially troubling because of how blatant it was. They weren't private affairs held in secret. This was the president showing off his adultery in the most prominent building in America, where employees were purportedly employed by the American people. This particular detail demonstrates Kennedy's conceit. Jackie was aware. When Jackie pointed to Ware's desk during a White House tour with a Paris Match reporter, she acknowledged in French that this was the woman having an affair with her husband. Jackie was subjected to this humiliation in front of international media in her own home. Marilyn Monroe. The affair that might never have occurred. Everyone recalls Monroe's seductive birthday greeting. Mr. President on May 19, 1962, at Madison Square Garden. Just theater. Monroe approached the microphone with her trademark breathy voice after removing her fur cloak to reveal a skin-tight gown covered with rhinestones. Romance rumors started right away since the performance was so passionate. However, the majority are unaware of this. There weren't many chances for Kennedy and Monroe to truly spend time together. Only a few times may they have been in the same location at the same time, according to historians who examined their lives. Intimate contact was most likely to have occurred on March 24, 1962, at Bing Crosby's Palm Springs residence. One of Monroe's pals claimed to have heard what appeared to be Kennedy's voice during a phone conversation with Monroe that weekend when both were allegedly at a party there. But consider what this shows. If there was a relationship between Kennedy and Monroe, it was most likely a one-night encounter that was exaggerated by decades of rumors. Although it's tempting to imagine a romantic relationship between America's president and the biggest celebrity in Hollywood, the truth was most likely far more ordinary. The alleged affair is not what makes Monroe's story heartbreaking. That's what transpired later. Monroe was discovered dead from barbiturate overdose less than 3 months after her birthday performance. Kennedy was killed precisely 1 year later. For decades, conspiracy theories have been fanned by the time. The mob link is Judith Campbell Exner. We are now in the midst of affairs that endangered not just Kennedy's marriage, but also the country's security. Kennedy and Judith Campbell Exner allegedly had a long-term connection. However, her close familiarity with the president was not what made her dangerous. Her prior relationships were the cause. Kennedy should have been warned when Exner met him at a concert through Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was already well known for his dubious connections, but Kennedy disregarded clear dangers since he was so comfortable handling several relationships. Kennedy reportedly was unaware of Exner's concurrent involvement with infamous mafia boss Sam Giannana. Consider the ramifications. The president and organized crime have a mistress in common. There was an enormous risk of national security breaches, covert leaks, and blackmail. Exner's assertions, however, go farther. She claims to have acted as a liaison between Kennedy and Giannana, delivering communications and enabling the president and mafia to communicate. If accurate, Kennedy was allegedly directing the fight against organized crime while utilizing his mistress as a conduit. FBI surveillance was used since the situation got so bad. J. Kennedy was forced to break up with Edgar Hoover after he informed him about surveillance. Not because it was wrong, but because he had been caught. However, this particular detail demonstrates Kennedy's carelessness. Exner says that in order to safeguard his political career, she had to have an abortion when she became pregnant with his child. If accurate, Kennedy was prepared to take a possible life in order to protect his reputation. The murder that silenced secrets was Mary Pono Meyer. Not simply because of the affair, but also because of how it ended. We have arrived to the most unsettling tale. Artist and socialite Mary Poncho Meyer is said to have had a close relationship with Kennedy for 2 years. However, what transpired during their affair is not what makes her narrative frightening. That's what transpired following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Meyer was more than a mere victory. Like Jackie, she was well-educated, clever, and well-known in society. But she also had an adventurous spirit that the president seemed to find fascinating. Meir stood out for her openness to question Kennedy on political issues and her intellectual curiosity. She wasn't happy to be just another attractive woman in his presence. She was interested in learning about the intricacies of policy and power that influenced his choices. Sources claim that she developed into Kennedy's confidant, spending mornings in the Oval Office talking about significant issues. However, these weren't only lighthearted discussions about current affairs. According to reports, Meyer was eager to hear Kennedy's views on a wide range of topics, including foreign policy and civil rights, and she wasn't hesitant to voice her own. Perhaps even more perilous than their physical bond was their cerebral intimacy. They were so committed to each other that Meyer kept a journal in which he recorded their time together. This is where it starts to become chilly. Meyer became more outspoken about his suspicions about the official story after Kennedy was assassinated. She openly expressed her belief that Lee Harvey Oswald was not acting alone and started to raise awkward questions regarding the president's death circumstances. Meyer's doubts were not motivated by irrational conjecture or conspiracy ideas. She had known Kennedy well enough to know the political dynamics at play, the people he had made enemies with, and the risky games being played at the highest echelons of government. Because her inquiries were based on personal experience, they were especially dangerous to those who would rather the official narrative go unchallenged. 2 days before turning 44, on October 12, 1964, Meyer went for her daily stroll down the Georgetown towpath. She was shot in the head and heart in an execution-style manner. Even though it happened in broad daylight in one of the wealthiest communities in Washington, her murder has never been solved. This is where it becomes sinister, though. Her best friend called Meyer's sister and Washington Post editor Ben Bradley as soon as Meyer passed away. The acquaintance disclosed that Meyer had kept a diary that needed to be secured right away, indicating that people were aware that her writings contained private information. The events that followed read like an espionage thriller. When the Bradleys arrived at Meyer's art studio in a hurry, CIA's head of counterintelligence, James Angleton, was already there with bolt cutters. Meyer's diary worried the CIA so much that they dispatched their top intelligence officer to get it before anyone else could see it. Consider the ramifications. A murder victim's private area was being broken into by America's most powerful intelligence organization in order to delete evidence. Eventually, the diary, a notebook primarily composed of doodles and paint swatches, was located. However, some pages revealed potentially more damaging information regarding what Meyer had discovered while in Kennedy's inner circle, as well as hints of an affair with an unidentified lover. The most terrifying detail is right here. In order to eliminate any evidence that would have supported a police inquiry, Ben Bradley decided to burn the notebook. It was an obvious message. Mary Pinchot Meyer passed away because she knew too much. The startling reality about the intern, Mimi Alford. If you found the earlier stories unsettling, you should wait until you hear about Mimi Alford. Almost 50 years later, in 2012, Alford released a memoir that shocked the historical world. Her tale shows Kennedy at his worst, abusing his position of authority to control and take advantage of a helpless adolescent. When Kennedy first contacted her, Alford was just 19 years old and had been employed at the White House for only 4 days. It began innocently. She received an invitation to the White House pool with the president and staff. She sensed, however, that things was going to alter forever as Kennedy appeared and floated toward her with grace. Kennedy's true nature was revealed by the deliberate seduction that followed. He invited Alford and other employees to the West Sitting Hall for refreshments. However, as the evening wore on, Alford and Kennedy were by themselves, touring the White House's private apartments while Jackie and the kids were on summer vacation. This is the heartbreaking detail. In what he mockingly referred to as Mrs. Kennedy's room, Kennedy stole Alford's virginity. For days into her internship, a 19-year-old intern lost her innocence in front of the president in his wife's bedroom. The setting, the power dynamics, and the total absence of meaningful consent. When you think clearly, it's terrifying. However, things worsen. Kennedy seemed utterly unaffected by their contact, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He summoned a car to drive Alfred home, leaving her to cope with her bewilderment and mixed feelings by herself. Alfred eagerly awaited Kennedy's calls whenever Jackie was abroad during their 18-month romance. She acknowledges that she didn't feel guilty at the time. In her 19-year-old thinking, she was just passing the time while Kennedy's wife was away rather than interfering with his marriage. This is the most unsettling aspect, though. Alfred claims that at a swimming pool party, Kennedy once made her give an oral performance on Dave Powers. She hardly remembers this, but she characterizes it as pathetic and sordid. A year later, Teddy Kennedy made a similar request, and Alfred finally mustered the courage to turn him down. Jackie's decision. Why did she stay? One question remains, unanswered throughout this video. Jackie stayed, but why? Why had a successful, intelligent woman been subjected to such private treachery and public humiliation? The response highlights a significant aspect of politics, power, and individual sacrifice throughout the 1960s. Jackie wasn't a helpless person. She took part in a well-thought-out plan. She recognized the charm and charisma of her spouse. He was attractive to other women because of the same traits that made him a successful politician. Jackie had seen her father act in a similar manner as a child. Kennedy's pattern was therefore not surprising. Rather, it was well known. She was aware that marriage would not alter his core character. Here's what complicates Jackie's case even further, though. Unlike other political wives, she had choices. She was wealthy, had her own social network, and was intelligent enough to lead a self-sufficient life. But she decided to stay, and it was a calculated decision rather than an emotional one. No one knew the game as well as Jackie did. She was aware that all she had fought so hard to achieve would be lost if she left. Not only her union, but also her historical standing. Kennedy's political career would have ended with the 1960s divorce, but Jackie would have been reduced to the role of the lady who brought down Camelot. Rather, she executed the long game with expert accuracy. As much a part of the Kennedy mythology as Jack was, Jackie had her own aura of mystery. Under pressure, she transformed her shame into grace and her pain into power. She invested in her future legacy with each public appearance in which she grinned next to her cheating spouse. However, Jackie had a different understanding than the other women. She was supremely powerful. She was the lady history would remember, his wife, and the mother of his children. Her position was unassailable and permanent, but the affairs were only short-term diversions. Because she was Mrs. Kennedy and not just another victory, she could weather any controversy. Jackie's decision to stay had nothing to do with commitment or love. It has to do with legacy. Beyond marriage, she was constructing something. She was establishing a political dynasty that would outlive any personal wrongdoing. The affairs were merely the cost of her influence, power, and historical significance. She bore taxes in the same way that others do, as an unfavorable but essential expense of reaching a higher goal. Jackie's calculation turned out to be accurate in the end. She is regarded as one of America's most recognizable first ladies today. The majority of Kennedy's alleged mistresses are only historical footnotes, but what we have discovered goes beyond that. It provides an insight into the unchecked use of power. Kennedy thought his charm and charisma would shield him from any controversy, making him invincible. He was correct for the most part. Politicians were shielded by the media in the 1960s in ways that don't seem feasible today. Despite being aware of Kennedy's extramarital affairs, reporters choose not to cover them. Agents of the Secret Service saw improper behavior but said nothing. Although they promoted interactions, White House employees never made public statements. Kennedy was able to take more and more risky chances because of this culture of silence. Kennedy's affairs went beyond personal shortcomings, ranging from the German call lady who may have been a spy to mafia ties endangering national security. They were possible catastrophes that might have altered the course of American history. What this says about consent and power dynamics, however, may be the most unsettling. Kennedy had a lot of young, inexperienced women in his life who were totally overpowered by his power and status. They couldn't genuinely agree to be in a relationship with someone who had such complete control over their personal and professional lives. From a contemporary standpoint, Kennedy was more than just a charming president who had a thing for ladies. He was a serial predator who took advantage of weaker people by utilizing his position. The corruption that results from unbridled power is demonstrated by the fact that this behavior was accepted and shielded. Behind Camelot's glitzy exterior was a web of secrets, lies, and exploitation that ultimately cost many people their lives, reputations, and futures. This is why the Kennedy mystique continues to captivate us. It symbolizes both the height of American political success and the depths of individual moral failure. We cannot divorce Kennedy's political accomplishments from his personal shortcomings when we reflect on his legacy. He was dangerous in addition to being an outstanding leader because of his charm and self-assurance, using authority to fulfill wants without considering the repercussions. In addition to being Kennedy's purported mistresses, the women on this list should be remembered as people whose lives were irrevocably altered by their experiences with absolute power. Their tales serve as cautionary tales about what happens when authority acts irresponsibly and charisma takes the place of morality. How do you feel about Jackie Kennedy's choice to keep quiet about her husband's extramarital affairs? Did she choose the best option for a woman in her position, or was she complicit? For further in-depth explorations of little-known aspects of American history, please subscribe and leave a comment.